Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes to talk about some of the exciting science and technology that's shaping and changing the cannabis and hemp industries. And occasionally, we stop to touch base on the financial and investment aspects of the cannabis industry as well. And so for today's podcast, we're welcoming back to the show Matt Carr, who is the Chief Trends Strategist from the Oxford Club. Welcome back to the show, Matt. It's always great to have you here and to hear your insights on the industry.
Well, thanks for having me back, Christine. I always love being here.
So I'm really anxious to have this conversation today. Earlier this month, you published an article on profit trends. And for the listeners that are out there, I'm going to put that link in the description of this podcast. So if you want to go take a look at that article, it's in the description. But you specifically kind of touched base on three of the major roadblocks for cannabis companies today and what they're facing, which all three, I think, could be virtually eliminated if we could have this discussion about federal legalization or at least descheduling of cannabis. So I would love to have you talk about those roadblocks today and really just kind of give your insights into some of how much easier I think life is going to be for cannabis companies here in the near future.
Yeah, well, you're 100% right. If we see like a descheduling or even like a rescheduling down to like a 4 or lower, the cannabis industry, all these three roadblocks would pretty much be eliminated. But right now, the biggest things that kind of impact the industry and for front and center for me is the 280E of the Internal Revenue Code. I've interviewed cannabis CEOs over the year. This is something that gets them all fired up. If you mention this to any kind of cannabis entrepreneur or business owner, they're likely going to give you an earful because it is easily the most hated tax provision in the business. Now, this was introduced back in the 1980s during the height of the war on drugs, the Reagan era. What you had was a convicted cocaine trafficker who argued in front of a judge that he should be able to deduct his business expenses, right? He exploited a loophole in the deduction side. And it's a pretty fascinating story. It was pretty interesting. Now, the very next year, Congress got together, Armstrong and Senate Finance Committee Subcommittee Chairman Bob Dole, they came up with 280E. And 280E basically says that, if you operate a business that is illegal, then you can't deduct normal business expenses. So that means you're not deducting rent, utilities, employee salaries, phones, any of that kind of stuff. So for normal companies, when you pay your federal income taxes, you start with gross income, right? So you're taking gross income, you're subtracting your business expenses, like I said, things like rent, utilities, employee salaries, advertising costs, phone costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That gives you your taxable income. This is what you pay taxes on that amount. It's pretty straightforward and simple. But since 280E exists to prevent, drug dealers and drug traffickers from using this tax code to their advantage, all these decades later, cannabis companies are being impacted by this. And so if you're paying taxes on gross income, that's kind of a nightmare. And for cannabis companies, what this translates to is many of them are paying tax rates 70% or higher. In fact, there have been dispensary owners that talk that they are paying nearly double the amount in taxes of what their businesses actually bring in. So for me, that roadblock right there is the biggest roadblock for the industry. If that was removed, this would create an entirely different outlook for cannabis companies because, you're increasing profitability almost overnight.
Right. And that's always just kind of baffled me. I've been in the industry since early 2016 and just the dispensaries, the places that I've worked, that was always kind of the major topic of conversation was the tax rate that has to be paid. And then last year kind of was an eye-opener for me, because as the cannabis industry is paying the highest amount of taxes, as a regulated business, they also didn't receive any benefits when we're talking about pandemic, support and those kinds of things. They received very, very little from the government in terms of helping them stay open, despite the fact that they were considered an essential business. So it's like they're paying an exorbitant amount of tax and not getting anything in return.
Exactly. You're declared an essential business, then you're taxed at this very high rate. Now, I think what it really shows, what excites me about 280E and the possibility for descheduling, is we can see how much cannabis companies are bringing in now. We can see that companies have started to become profitable year over year, especially after last year, because sales did boom because of their being declared an essential business. You take that out of the equation, what are you talking about now for that industry in terms of profits? Like I said, that's basically doubling their profits or more overnight, and that I think will send shares skyrocketing higher.
What an incredible boost that will be to the industry when it comes. Now, roadblock number 2, I wanted to touch base on this first before I let you dive into the details here. You talked about institutional support. So before we actually dive into that and getting into the nitty gritty of that, can you first define really what you mean by institutional support?
Well, institutional supports in terms of, I think the second part I was talking about there was actually having some financial services, right? That you have access to capital. You have $2 trillion in bank capital that's kind of sitting there. Less than 1% of that is going to the cannabis industry. And that's because, banks are federally insured. Cannabis businesses are still illegal at the federal level. That's creates this sort of huge disconnect and problem, because these are businesses that can't accept credit cards. They can't really acquire loans. That's why you're doing a lot of these sale leasebacks or any of these like warrants to get, or guarantees to get funding. You can't set up deposit accounts. You can't write checks or run payroll for a lot of time. We've talked about in the past that they've been paying taxes in cash. that's a huge thing. So without like banking services, without any of these like basic financial services, these companies are still at a major disadvantage. Now that could be changed if something which we just had passed the House, the Safe Banking Act, that would help change all of that. It essentially would give cannabis companies, or would allow banks to give cannabis companies the business and the financial services that every other industry in this country enjoys. So that would create another boom for the industry, right? Because that means if you have access to more of these loans, we've already seen that mergers and acquisitions are up this year. These increased 94% year over year in the first quarter. But that enables those companies to have access to even better capital and could expand their businesses by even accelerating this M&A activity.
Right. Now, it's always just kind of blown my mind that that banks are so hesitant, even though there's so much regulation, there's so much tracking, there's so many things that are required to work in the cannabis industry to begin with. And I understand that it's still kind of, I don't know, it's kind of in limbo now, I think. For a long time, it was still kind of considered that shady underbelly of industry. And now I feel like it's kind of moved up a couple of ranks, but banks are still pretty hesitant. And I know that it has to do with the federal legalization. And I really hope that when that switch is flipped, that banks are going to open up to it more and be more receptive of the industry. I mean, my gosh, the industry started back in 1996. we're looking at several years of running legitimate businesses. So it's going to be interesting, I think, to see the banks kind of do an about face when this all happens. But in the meantime, let's talk about this other roadblock that you mentioned, though, in terms of actually investing. So what's going on with the various pot stocks, and this lack of institutional support obviously is putting a damper on how these companies can be invested in and traded.
Yeah, so this goes back to just federal legalization, right? So if there's a change at the federal level, you can have institutional buyers, institutional investors come in and support these companies. Right now, since most of these companies, especially the American multi-state operators, MSOs, they trade over the counter in the United States. They cannot uplist to the NYSE or the NASDAQ. We already know that there are several that have put all their ducks in a row so that when there is a change at the federal level, they can uplist to one of these major exchanges. But because it gets into this still that it's illegal at the federal level, institutional investors really can't put a lot into it. You are starting to see some changes, like we saw earlier this year, where Green Thumb Industries, they did $100 million sale share to a big institutional buyer. You are starting to see a little bit of kind of dipping their toes into the industry because they know there is a change taking. I think most of us are aware that there's probably a change taking place at the federal level within the next couple of years. I still think it's. I mean, I would hope it's now months away instead of years away, because and so that gives they're starting to give everybody a little bit more confidence that there's a change, and you can kind of start pushing back again. But at the same time, if a stock is trading OTC, I've kind of outlined in the past that you can look at the share volume for a company like Curaleaf versus a company which trades OTC here in the U.S. versus, let's say, Canopy Growth or Tilray, 4 times higher for those major those Canadian companies which are listed on major U.S. exchanges than Curaleaf. So that's a huge difference. That's a considerable difference. And then at the same time, not only institutional investors kind of getting involved in the industry, but if these companies are able to uplist, then that opens up to a lot more retail investors. Robinhood account, a lot of times they prevent you from trading OTC. Even traditional brokerages will make you take a test to see if you understand the risks of over-the-counter trading. But I always say, like, the OTC has a lot of really great stocks that are just right now are prevented from uplisting in the U.S.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely fascinating, I think, to watch as some of these things evolve and you start to see more happening. There's several apps out there now, I think, that are kind of helping people invest, in different cannabis stocks and things like that. I'm just very, as we've watched all of this kind of shift and change over the last several years, I just feel like you're saying, this switch, this one little switch that everybody's waiting on, basically on pins and needles. Because like you said, we're hoping it's months now, not years, like we've been talking. And so I just feel like when that switch is flipped, we're going to see just an incredible amount of activity just happen almost overnight.
Yeah, and you can look at the fact, like I said, we had the House pass the Safe Banking Act once again. This was passed in 2019. I was killed in the Senate, but now that the Democrats control the Senate and the House, the outlook for the Safe Banking Act is very strong. At the same time, we do know that you have 3 senators that are working on a comprehensive bill that is going to make a change at the federal level. What that's going to be, they don't want to say, but I would imagine that it's probably descheduling. It's probably also looking to get rid of 280E. That would be a massive boon for the industry. And this is an industry like where right now the North American Marijuana Index has pulled back roughly 54% from those highs that we saw back in February. So we're at this really kind of great discounted opportunity moment.
Interesting. Now you kind of touched on it a little bit, and we've been talking about it through this whole podcast in terms of what needs to happen. But what are the actual next steps? I mean, are we really just kind of in that stage of hurry up and wait? Now we just have to wait to see where the Safe Banking Act and where the MORE Act and where all of this stuff goes in Senate? Or what's your crystal ball kind of say about where these next steps are going to lead us, and how's it really, what can cannabis industry businesses do, or can we do anything?
So I actually do believe that we are in kind of a hurry up and wait moment. Right now, you're waiting for the Senate to introduce their bill to make some headway on the Safe Banking Act. We do know that, like I said, that a change is coming. Right now, though, the pandemic continues to, as it should, continues to take priority. The U.S. kind of reestablishing international relationships is a priority. So that's kind of what's taking place. Biden still has his infrastructure plan, which they haven't found any sort of common ground for what that is going to look like or a total amount that they want to spend. So cannabis is in this mix. Cannabis is in this mix to, one, provide new jobs, provide tax revenue, which is needed, but we just need them to move forward with a bill, to introduce a bill at the federal level to make these changes.
Well, one thing is for certain, Matt, is that the next several months, couple of years are definitely going to impact the cannabis industry. It's going to impact how cannabis does business, how people invest in cannabis. I think it's just, I think there's just so much opportunity that's going to hit us here in the next, several months to a couple years. You can feel that we're right there on the cusp of change, and it's so exciting. And it's always a pleasure to have you here on the show and to have you share your expertise and your insights into this, because clearly, you're paying attention to everything that's happening out there and keeping your finger on the pulse of the industry. So real quick, just give our listeners an idea of how they can take advantage of the information that you provide at the Oxford Club, or how they can get more information or reach out to you personally.
Okay, yeah. And I just want to follow up. Yeah, I think right now it is a very exciting time to be a cannabis investor. It's also kind of, I think, one of the most dangerous times, because you don't want to get caught up in too much euphoria. And you don't want to get caught, like if something goes, if we get something goes completely sideways at the federal. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're talking about a change at the federal level, hopefully within the next couple of months. Now, if anybody's interested in finding out more about the cannabis space, they can always check me out at profittrends.com. Also, Profit Trends on YouTube, as well as Strategic Trends Investor on Instagram, Profit Trends on Twitter. Those are all the places that I'm there, and feel free to leave a comment, and I try to answer as many comments as I can.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Matt. And of course, we're going to have you back in a few months. We try to touch base with you occasionally throughout the year. So we really appreciate you being here today, and we look forward to hearing more about all this exciting news that's happening right now in the cannabis industry.
And I look forward to coming back. Thanks, Christina.